Hello. Today I'm going to be talking about crit rate and how does crit rate work or what my findings were about crit rate. I don't really have a full refined system as this is just a thesis, and based off what my findings were, this is my final conclusion as of right now. And what I am predicting is how crit rate works and how you can utilize crit rate to your advantage, and what you need to know about crit rate. You don't spend useless time trying to increase crit rate when it doesn't really matter. Okay, so first thing I want to address is there are three things that you want to know about crit rate or crit in general. So there is a crit rate, which is if we look at weapons, so we have crit, and this right here is going to be the basis of a standardized crit. So this is generally what I'm going to reference as crit. And then we're going to look at crit resistance, which is only available on a chassis. Only the chassis have crit resistance, and that applies to everything. You can see right here as well. As you can see right here as well. Crit resistant only is on chassis. Now that I've established that, there's going to be another aspect, and the other aspect is going to be crit percentages. The crit percentages look something kind of like this. Well, obviously, is anything with a crit rate plus 15%. You can also get these from abilities such as foul play, which gives plus 15%. Other characters have abilities like this. For example, Dana as well has one right. No, where she has it, I think, in her skills when she aims in. So on launching the first attack each turn, there's a crit rate plus 15%. So yes, other characters do have this. I think Rosa as well has this as a neuron module somewhere, I think. Is it? Yeah, right here. When she's in ideal range. So when she's 2 spaces away from the target, she gets a plus 15% crit rate. So there is going to be crit rate, crit resistance, and then there's going to be crit percentages. Now, crit resistance is going to determine the final result of crits. The equation you want to be looking at is crit is going to come first, and then there's going to be a crit resistance, and then crit resistance is going to filter out crit, and then what's going to be applied after that will be a percentage, and then that percentage will then be additive to the crit percentage that's also being added. So let's assume that your crit resistance for whatever you're fighting is 1700, and let's assume that your crit rate is 1701. Now, because you're above the threshold of crit resistance, you're going to be able to crit, and so you're going to be able to crit, and it's going to give you a crit percentage, and then that will be added to the crit percentage, which will then give you a final crit rate, which will be the final crit that you'll get at the end. So crit formula revolves around, which will be crit resistance, and then crit percentage, which will then equate to a final crit for you. Okay, so today I'm going to also present to you that my findings and thesis is that I believe in something called a threshold theory. And the threshold theory is that everything in this game is based off a threshold. And what it means is that imagine everything is a stat, right? And every single stat is within a specific tier. So 800 is tier 1, 1600 is tier 2, 2400 is tier 3, right? And whatever is within these ranges will be in these tiers. And because they're in these tiers, this will drastically affect how percentages work. And this not just only affects crit rate, but it also affects defense mitigations, how much damage percentage is being calculated to a damage mitigation ratio. The basis theory of crit rate is that everything is on these thresholds, and why I think there are these thresholds is basically what I'm going to show you right now, which is very interesting. So we're going to go here and I'm going to show you all the stats so that nothing is tampered with, if that makes sense. So if the crit here is 110, this is going to be 1582. And we do know that we're also getting something from pilot, right? So 1582. We're looking at 1682, 1739, I think. And this is going to be without any crit. So we're just going to do this with range suppression. So right now we are getting no crit at all. No crit percentages for Sylvie. So we're just going based off just a crit of 1739. So we're going to go shoot a target. So if we look here, the weapon is 37, and if we look here, the enemy is 38. So assuming that crit resistance and crit rate is often very linear, and what I mean by linear is that crit resistance will to some extent be slightly either higher or slightly lower than crit resistance, or sorry, lower than the crit of the same leveled weapon versus the same leveled enemy. So right here, we already know that the crit rate for this is 14%. So we're looking at that, which is 14%. We're going to go and look at something that's somewhat lower. I think Medical Waste is a good mission. This will be the first mission.
What the guards head off to? Look.
Okay, so we know that the crit resistance prior was 14.
Close in and melee that sniper.
Here the crit resistance is 26%. So assuming that our crit rate was 1739, and this is like the bottom of the barrel, I'm gonna take this as tier 1. So at tier 1 enemies, we're doing 26% crit. At the same level, which I'm going to assume is the same tier as our level, we're looking at 14%. So the deviation between crit resistance and crit rate looks about an 11% deviation from tier 1 and to the current level we are at, which is at... So at 1739 crit, we're looking at a deviation between the lowest tier we can get to the highest tier, which is about an 11% deviation or difference between the two. Okay, so right now I'm going to show you that why my theory is threshold theory as well is that if we look at crit rate, right, and we assume that the max crit rate that we have on the spec is 1739, if I modify this mech and I get any crit, right, we're going to find out if it increases by number or if it increases by specific threshold. So we're gonna okay, we got weapon crit plus 74, so we're gonna confirm this, and we're gonna go in and see if our crit rises and by how much. As you can see, it went up by 2%. So from 14%, now we are at 16%. As you just saw, we rose our crit by 74 points. That is almost about 100. So I'm assuming that the number is around a threshold point of maybe 50, maybe 75. As we were probably a little bit closer to the threshold, so it's a little bit more than that. I think it's every 50 points maybe that determines 2% extra crit. And we're going to go check on lower tier enemies and see if it goes up to 28% to see that if it's linear in that regard. So it was 26% and now it's at 27%. So it would seem that either the number is slightly closer, so from 26% there's some deviation of a diminishing return the higher the number is compared to when the number is lower. So for example, it would be, even though we can hit harder here, the number is somewhat slightly lower, not by a lot. So the deviation doesn't look like it's by 5%. It looks more like around maybe 0.5%, compared to when we're fighting enemies that are way tougher or about the same level we are at, if not around the same in terms of gun level and enemy level. We did notice that it jumped from 14% to 16%, and here it went from 26% to 27%. It's not that the enemy has higher crit resistance. It usually, I think this means that there is a diminishing return the higher the number gets to crit rate ratio, if that makes sense. So as we can see, the diminishing returns is not that great. It looks like maybe about 0.5% even at 27%, or even at 26%. Okay, so now we're going to see what happens when we are under the crit rate and why I think that crit rate is somewhat very linear. It would have to be linear, especially if the enemy is 37 to 38, and this is more of an hypothesis theory, is that between crit rate and crit resistance, it has to be somewhat linear. I don't know which one comes first, whether crit resistance is naturally higher than crit rate, or if crit rate is somewhat lower. But my suggestion is that crit rate is would be somewhat nearby crit resistance almost at all times, and I think the one that comes first is usually probably crit resistance. So I think crit resistance is naturally higher than crit rate because you have stats that can be risen to where crit resistance is at. I guess we'll use a weapon for an example. The enemies that we're fighting were around, I think, level 38 if I'm not mistaken. So if we use a gun with lower crit rate, and I think we'll just recalculate it from here. So if we equip this right here, and I don't think this has anything on it right now. It doesn't. And the crit is 1271. We don't have any bonuses here, so we can just calculate the 157. We're looking at 1425 crit, and why we're calculating 157 would be for the neuron module. If we go here, range crit is 157. So the number that we're looking at is a crit rate of 1425. All we would have to do is, well, if the crit rate is actually 0, we would have to test this against an enemy 10 times to get a result. If we shot it the 11th time, there would naturally be a crit, but if there isn't a crit, then the rate is 0%. Which would prove the theory that crit resistance is more closer to where it's slightly above crit rate at all times. As you can see right here, that the crit rate is now at 2%. That's crazy. So we do know to some extent that we are now reaching a very close threshold towards we're nearby crit resistance. We're going to be underneath crit resistance. So if we know that the natural crit rate of these guns would be around 1200, then the crit would probably lean a little more towards this would lean a little bit slightly lesser, maybe around 1300, so 1380. So if we can somewhat decrease this number a little bit further, we might be able to get it to 0%. We found a weapon slightly lower, this one with a crit rate of 1122. We're going to add 157, and we're going to get 1279. So this is actually kind of good. Now we're going to retest. Now my theory is correct that the crit rate would have to be around 1300, then we're going to see 0%. And there you go. So this is basically what I'm trying to say, is that if we look at we are now under the crit resistance. So we do know that if we're looking at 1279, which is where we got the threshold, which I'm assuming the threshold has to be somewhere between, it has to be 1300. So once we dipped below 1300, we now no longer have the 2% crit that we naturally had prior, and the number that we had prior was 1425, and we had 2% crit. So we just literally went down by about, I think, 125 points almost, and now we have 0% crit. So this is where my theory comes into play, because if we go back and we just take a real close look at weapons, so the natural legendary state of, this is like the, I think this is the weaker version, if I'm not mistaken, of crit. I'm not sure. I think it might be. It naturally has a crit rate of 1472, and we know at 1472 we saw 2%, or at 1425 we saw a crit rate of about 2%, right? So let's assume we don't have any crit bonuses at all. We had nothing, and this is the only crit source. We're only going to have 2% crit. Now, that does seem a little logical, right? At first, that, okay, it's somewhere very linear, where because this is a legendary weapon, it should somewhat outperform basic weaponry. And what that would mean is that if this weapon is at 1122 and then this weapon is at 1271, they're naturally going to have 0% crit rate without any bonuses. But if you get a legendary sniper, well, if you raise it or get one that's according to the level, and it comes with a crit of 1472 because the enemies we were fighting are level 38, and this is a level 37 weapon, and you saw even then it's at 2% without any crit bonuses at all. As you see, there's no crit bonuses there. There's only one right here, and I think here. So if we were to jump back into the game, we would probably see maybe 4 to 6% if we're just looking at the raw gun stats that we have right here. But we also have to calculate that our neuron modules, which will bump us up by, I think, 200 points. But if it is going up by 2%, right, then it would only be at 6%, because it'll be every 100 points you'll get 2, 4, 6, right? But I don't think it works like that. I think there are thresholds, and what it means is that when you start reaching a higher tier of a number bracket, you get a bonus crit. But for every smaller threshold, you start to get a crit bonus, which is like a 2% crit or 1% crit or a 0.5% crit if the crit is starting to reach too high. So it would look something like, imagine in order for you to reach tier 3, you need an overall crit rate of 1800, and you get like a plus 5% bonus. But before that, there are like these smaller milestones that only give you 2% or 1% or 0.5% the higher you get to these threshold bonuses. And then once you reach 1800, which puts you in the next tier, you get a greater bonus, right? And I think that's how it works, is that there's these thresholds that crit percentage bonuses you will get. And that's just by looking at this and how it's drastically affecting. Now, I'm going to jump back into the match, and I'm going to show you exactly that. So if we were to just equip this with the 110, which will make it back to 1739, as you see, it's 14%. Now, if the theory that going to be presented after seeing this would be that, well, it's because of diminishing returns, but that doesn't make sense either, because if there's diminishing returns, then you would have saw it by the time you wouldn't see it until you reach maybe 27% or 26%. The reason being is because prior we did see that happen when the number went from 26 to 27%, where here it jumped from 14% to 16%. But why would, at a higher level, it would only jump from 2%, and from a lower level it would only jump from 0.5 or maybe 0.75% on a lower enemy? Is it because of crit resistance? No, because the crit was naturally already higher on the lower enemy, but the bonus you got was lower, but it only happened and triggered when it started to reach a higher number. But here we're not even close to the 20%. We're still in the mid-range. We're like 14%, and it jumped to 16%. So from the 2% we saw at 1200 or 1300, from where we are now, which is about, I think, a jump of 300 points, we're seeing 14%. But if it was jumping every 2%, then we wouldn't have 14%, right? We would have something more like 6 or 8%. Now the question would be, where are we getting the 14% from? Now that's a good question, and I couldn't figure it out for a while, and I still don't know if I really know the answer. But what I'm assuming was going on, just just head canon at this point, is that there are small thresholds and then there are bigger thresholds. There are bonus thresholds and there are milestone thresholds. The milestone thresholds you're seeing are like halfway points that give you 2% or 2% naturally, but then start to diminish the higher you go. And then when you reach the bigger milestone, you get a fluctuation of a greater percentage. And this is somewhat kind of linear with the idea of tier, because when you start reaching a bracket of tier, obviously when you start raising your crit, you're going to be fighting enemies that are somewhat harder, and these enemies will have higher stats and they will be placed within the same tier as you, which will kind of keep crit rate kind of not too broken and within a very reasonable range, if that makes sense. So it would be that because the enemies are reaching your level, their crit resistance are going to rise, and because they're going to rise, it's going to lower your crit rate against them, because their stats are starting to rise, and now they're being placed into the same tier you're in. As for example, right here, as I showed you an example prior, was why is it that crit rate isn't linear? Why is it that the enemies on higher levels that are more closer to your weapons have lower crit rate, where when you fight enemies lower than you with higher level weapons have higher crit rate? Now that doesn't make any sense, because crit rate isn't something that just naturally changes like that. Usually within games, crit rate is kind of normal across the board. Whatever crit rate you have at a low level will kind of be the crit rate you have at a higher level anyway. It's very linear. But here that's not the case, because there's some degree of crit resistance. It's to some extent is preventing you from doing the maximum crit against the enemy. And so it's got to be very linear and very, very close to each other. And when you raise your stat of crit higher, you're able to do more crit rate against the enemy, more likely due because you're in a higher tier, and these tiers are marked by like number thresholds. For example, it would be if my crit rate finally reached 2000 and I did that mission again, I would have more crit rate and probably a greater fluctuation of crit rate. It would probably look more like the previous level where I had 26%, I would probably have 27 or 26%, or even maybe 30% in the current level I'm showing you right now. And you might go, well, that's because you obviously have a higher crit rate. That is true. But to some extent, because I have a higher crit rate, it's also placing me in a higher tier, which is affecting the amount of percentages I am doing to the enemy now. The percentage is going to be far greater. And I think that's how it works, is that these tiers kind of affect the percentages to some extent. But in order for these things to happen, you have to reach a very specific tier via a threshold of numbers. And so that would be my case theory of what I'm actually talking about when I say I think it's a threshold theory. Now I'm going to go even further into something that is kind of mind-blowing, is that, okay, so we went over crit rate and crit resistances, right? And how they're somewhat very close and linear. We do know that crit resistance, anything below crit resistance just becomes 0, and there are milestones, and then there are bigger milestones, and these bigger milestones are more than likely thresholds for tiers. When you graduate from a tier, you get a bigger percentage threshold towards a specific bonus. And I think that's how it works, where the smaller thresholds are kind of milestones within a tier before you reach a new tier. So it's like a halfway to before you reach a new tier. So we do know those things, but now I'm going to talk about how crit percentages work. Is that crit percentages, they work as additive and they are independent from everything in the game. And what it means is that nothing stops crit percentages. They act alone. They're a separate entity in the coding. I have no reason why they did that, but that's just how it works. And I'm about to show you what I mean by that. So again, you remember how I showed you that if you're able to reduce your crit rate down to almost 0%, so obviously we know if we did this right here, we're going to have 0%. But how are we going to get crit percentage? Well, Sylvie does have an ability here that gives her that ability, which would be foul play. So before I showed you that it was 0%. Okay, so back to what I was saying is that, okay, so we do know with this build that it's just straight 0%. There's nothing there. Like absolutely nothing there. So we will not be able to crit the enemy at all. But if we go here, and we add crit percentage, and by doing so, we will now be able to crit. Now, I don't think that we're going to receive the 15% crit percentage from our attack, but we are going to get some crit percentage here. And the reason being is because there is still crit resistances being applied. And in partial, those crit resistances is being applied because of the tiers I'm talking about. The tiers in general kind of affect the percentages of current stats, if that makes sense. And because our crit rate is like really low, if not 1179, we're kind of considered like a tier 1 enemy against a tier 3 enemy. So the enemy's crit resistance is naturally higher, so it's registering at 0%, but the 15% that we're getting is from crit percentage. So it's going to be, we're not going to be doing the full 15% crit because we are slightly below crit rate, if that, or we're slightly below the crit resistance, and so we're still going to get resisted by the enemy's crit resistance, but it's not going to be because of the crit resistance, but it's going to be because of the crit it's going to be because of the tier that they're in. And what I'm going to point out is right here, as you can see, it's 9%. And why do I say it's tier and not because we're under the crit resistance? Because we already know anything below crit resistance is naturally just 0. There's nothing we can do. And because it's 0, anything multiplied by 0 is obviously 0. So why would we have 9% here, but when we should be having 15% here? Is because to some extent, this tier, I don't know what the number is, it's somewhat drastically affecting a percentages being presented. As you saw, it's 15%, but it's 9%. So how far of a tier will determine how greater of these percentages are being affected. As you can see, it looks like it's affecting it at a range of 6%. And that's 6% when we're underneath crit threshold. So now, to counteract my statement I just made right now would be that, okay, well, what if we tried going above the crit threshold, which was around, I think, 1425, and then add the 15%, which would put us slightly above the crit threshold, will we get 17% crit, right? So that would be logical. Either 17 or 16%. It would be one of those two, but we can kind of shift towards the lower side, obviously, rather than the higher side. So it might be 16% instead. Okay, so we equipped the other weapon, which is giving us 1425. We were going to be operating above the crit threshold now by, I think, a few points, but it doesn't really matter because as long as we're above the threshold, we're going to get the bonus, which is 2%. And there you go. No matter how you look at it, I don't think there's any other system that would match what I'm saying right now. It goes to 17%, which means there's got to be these thresholds. There's these milestone thresholds, then there are these thresholds that grant bigger bonus percentages. And it's because of these tiers that are connected to these bigger thresholds that then drastically affect the percentages being granted. I don't know if it's multiplying the percentages by percentages or if it's adding a specific amount of percentage or subtracting a specific amount of percentages. So that is what I still have to figure out. But I haven't gotten to it yet because it took me days trying to figure this out and fine tuning and making sure that I didn't sound crazy, but I can also somewhat prove that I am crazy. And so this is really exciting because this means that crit to some extent operates alone and independent, but is affected by a tier. But it's still affected by a tier, but isn't affected by crit resistance alone. So crit resistance doesn't naturally affect it. It's more of the percentage differences between being on a lower tier spectrum. Because now that... Okay, Grant, thanks for interrupting me. But anyway, because now we're at the same tier or as the crit threshold, we're operating slightly above it. Now we get the full effect of the crit percentage, which proves that theory. And so now we have concrete evidence here, which this isn't where it just ends. There's so much more to this, and I'm not even done analyzing how crit rate works, but I'm probably gonna be looking into the crit, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just wrong here, but as of right now, I am proving why I believe this, and hopefully I'm making a good case. So another thing I found out was that there is no mercy crit. And so what I mean by mercy crit is when you reach 0%, it's just 0%. You can't crit. There is no extra hidden percentage of crit that you're going to crit at some point. No, if the game says it's 0%, it's 0%. You're not going to crit. There is no mercy crit where it's giving you a hidden bonus 5% chance to crit somewhere. So whatever the number you see is the number you do see. And so another one I hear a lot is that crit rate has a soft cap, and the soft cap is 30%, meaning it doesn't go over 30% regardless if that's what it says. Now, I had done a test and I ran the test multiple times, was that I did 30 shots against the same target you're seeing right now with a crit rate of 29%. The results, 14 of them were crits, where 16 were just normal shots. Now, it's very interesting because if the threshold of crit was naturally 30%, then the number would only be 8 to 9 shots out of 30 shots, right? That would be the most statistical evidence you can obviously muster. But why would it shift towards 14 out of 30 shots? Well, it possibly means that crit doesn't just soft cap at 30%. It actually goes further than 30%. In fact, I think there is no soft cap, and I think that crit can go up to 100%. And my reasoning for that is that there's nothing in the game that allows you to reach 100%. No matter if you got every crit percentage on the same character, you wouldn't reach 100% crit. And I think they did that for a reason. I think they decided not to cap out crit and decided to just not introduce the possibility of reaching 100% crit. And to further this, they decided to also create crit resistance to keep your crit below 100% at all times. And so I think this is why crit resistance actually exists in the first place, is to make sure players don't ever reach 100% critical rate at all. And I think that's kind of what I currently think about the soft cap of 30%. And to kind of prove my point why I don't think the soft cap of 30% is a real argument is because, like I just said before, is that this is what I think the devs were doing and why they introduced crit resistance in the first place. And on top of that, a lot of character skills allow them to go over 30% crit rate. And I think I can get over 31% crit rate with Sylvia if I'm not mistaken. If I just do this. There you go. Oh, that's a pretty crazy roll. 91. It's kind of crazy. And then let's see. we do have foul play, and if we do get her ascension at 15%, that'd be massive, but I ain't gonna spend anything. I gotta save for Eileen. She's coming in a few weeks, so I'm really excited about that. So if we go here, as you see right here, it does reach over 31%. In fact, it will probably reach as high as you can get it to reach. But eventually it's going to lower due to crit resistance, and so you'll never ever be able to reach 100% because there's just not enough things giving you the added bonuses that will allow you to reach 100% crit. On top of not only that, but crit resistance is also capping you, and then you also have bracket tier thresholds, which also affects percentages. So even if you could get to 80%, you also have to account for all those things, which are probably lowered down to maybe 60%. Instead of 80% if that's where you're at. And so it will look something like that. So that is basically what I'm trying to say, is that the soft cap for crit rate is definitely not 30%. Okay, and so I'm going to finish off this video right here with a few final notes and thoughts. Is that I'm also going to recap a little bit here about what crit really is and how you should probably approach crit and how the mechanisms work, so you can better fine-tune your builds. Finishing my previous few minutes of talking was that yes, there is a somewhat a gate system, and the gate system is that you can still crit after having 0% crit from the gun's crit. Now, why would they do that? It would be more like the idea that they probably created this gate system for people who didn't invest into crit rate at all, or didn't really add crit rate bonuses to their weapon or increase crit rate, so they would be operating underneath the crit, and so it would allow them to crit naturally by having crit percentages built into the characters. If you just, as I shown you previously, that most characters at some point will kind of have like a 15% crit bonus or 15% critical hit rate bonus. And so I know a lot of people might overlook to some extent like the crit aspect, and because they were probably expecting this, they probably knew that a large majority of people would probably have a natural crit rate of 0% or if not 2%. And this would drastically affect how you engage in the game, because that would mean that because you have low crit, you either would lose your game because you weren't able to dish out enough damage, as not being able to crit is a significant amount of lost damage. And so my theory is that they created this gate system to allow players to somewhat stay consistent in completing content where it wasn't too tough to the point where they couldn't dish out damage, and you could somewhat win even if the odds were not in your favor to some extent. So like even if you weren't strong enough, you might be able to crit a few times and get a win. And so they wanted players to somewhat be able to pass the content, and so they created a sort of a gate system so that you would be able to bypass certain aspects of the game's mechanics. And I think that's why crit rate bonus does exist, or the crit rate percentages do exist to some extent, and why it bypasses crit resistance. But then again, crit percentage is not something that's widely given massively. You can only really get it from a few sources, and that's just about it. Like you can maybe get 10% crit rate from a gold tier mod, but it's a gold tier mod, right? So it's like you gotta sacrifice a lot and you gotta invest heavily into something. Or you might have Sylvie where she gets a 15% crit on her Ascension 3, which does need like 4. It requires 4 Sylvies just to get Ascension 3, which is a lot. So they were banking on the idea that if you wanted to have more of a greater chance at completing content, then you would have to pay for it, right? To some extent, whether it be paying for time or paying with money. I'm going to recap is that there's a crit rate percentage, there's crit rate, and then there's a crit threshold, there's a crit resistant threshold, and then there's milestones, and then there are going to be thresholds, and these thresholds are attached to tiers which to some extent affect how your percentages are being granted and how much percentage you will be given based off these tiers. If you're below a specific tier against the enemy, your percentages will be drastically altered in a weaker format, so you don't perform exceptionally well against these higher targets. But the closer you reach to these tiers, you're granted a bigger bonus percentage. Now if someone could figure out how much these numbers and percentages are affected based off these tiers, that'd be great. If everything I'm saying right now is true, then someone would eventually figure out these tiers, if not me, as I will further be looking into these and trying to figure it out slowly. But I think I kind of got the gist of it. And so this is kind of a long video, and if you want the more in detail information, I'm going to put timestamps in the description so you guys can go back and kind of re-listen and make sure you understand it more. So I'm going to put timestamps in the bottom so you guys can go back. Now that we know a lot about crit rate and how it kind of works, how does this shape how we can utilize this? My advice is that don't worry too much on the idea of crit, but what you do want to know is you do want to be somewhat about maybe 300 to 400 over the crit threshold. And we do know that the crit threshold is somewhere within the range of a weapon and the enemy. So a level 37 enemy or 38 enemy will be somewhat within the range of the 37 weapon. As for example, I'll kind of give you sort of a showcase. So what I mean was that if you look at the level 37 weapon, it has a crit of 1472. And if we look at the enemy, well, the enemy is going to have slightly lesser crit resistance compared to the legendary weapon of its level. So if the legendary weapon is 1472, then the enemy you're facing that's at the same level will be slightly below that number just to reach the next threshold below that. So there'll be a 2%, you'll be probably 2% crit rate higher than the enemy of the same caliber. And because of that, you want to be somewhat around 400 points above that number. So if, for example, if we're using the Gazer, which would be a crit of 1472, we want to reach a crit rate of 1872. And the reason for this is because for every 100 points will grant us 2% crit rate, or maybe 2 to 4% crit rate, and it might give you 3% the higher you go. So if we raise this number by 400 points, then we're looking at about an 8% increase in crit rate. But then we also get a tier list bracket bonus percentage, so it won't be 8%, it might give us 13% in total. And this will give us a base crit rate of maybe 13% or 14%, and then we can start stacking on crit rate percentage, which will then beef it up to 29% or 30%. And then if you add skills that also do crit rate, then you can get it to 45%, because as I said before, that nothing affects crit rate other than the tier bracket. And because of that, crit resistance will not diminish the crit rate percentage, but will only diminish the crit rate given by the crit, if that makes sense. From what we do also know is that crit rate isn't diminished by the diminishing returns after 30%, which you have seen that it starts to diminish at some point, but it doesn't diminish tier, or crit rate percentage doesn't diminish as much, or if at all, from being over 30% compared to how crit is diminished when reaching closer to 30%. And so I think I can also prove that as well. So that's crit rate percentage. I think if we go to
melee that sniper.
As you can see right here, we are at 42%. So how do we expect to get this number? So if by some chance crit rate suffer diminishing returns, we would not have 42%. How do we know? Because if prior we were able to get to 27% right? And we add 15 to 27%, 37, right? Plus 5, which would be 42%. And so, yes, crit rate percentage bonuses are not affected at all by diminishing returns over 30%. However, the only thing that will be affected by diminishing returns is just the crit rate or the crit percentages from crit, which is if so. To just better refine my thoughts here is that you want to raise your crit rate above the crit threshold just enough to where diminishing returns don't drastically start affecting you, but to some extent you're reaching there, and that's usually around 60% of 30% crit rate. So it would mean that you want to somewhat get a range of either 15% crit rate or 20% crit rate just on crit alone. And then from there, you want to start stacking on crit rate bonus percentages to get to the 40-ish percent, the 50% range of crit. Because like I said, you want every other shot to do a crit. If you were to shoot 10 targets, would do crit to 5, but because the game favors a higher number, it's not going to be 5, it might be 7, or it might actually hit for 8 instead. So I do believe to some extent there is a pseudo RNG element to the system as well, where it favors a higher number naturally. That's how you would want to approach it. Is I would say that you would want to raise it by 400 points, 3 to 400 points, because I think that's usually where a threshold tier would probably be at to give you the 15% or 21% crit base that you would need to then start stacking crit percentages on top of that. And so this makes crit rate very valuable, and any aspect or avenue of getting crit rate becomes very good for a character. For example, Sylvie at Ascension 3, that 15% crit rate is the difference between what you just saw 42% being from 42% to technically 57%. So like that is pretty massive, like huge. And usually when you're fighting targets that are naturally closer to your level, I mean, having a natural 30% from foul play and Sylvie's ascension level start to really matter, because it means that if you're underneath the crit threshold, you're still doing 30% crit rate to the target regardless. Well, maybe a little less than that, but it's not going to be too much. It might be around like 6% deviation, so it might be like 24% crit rate rather than 30%, but that's still something. And that can really make a difference. I think that would be the end of this video. I just want to say that if you guys like the content, please leave a like and please subscribe to the channel, because I try to make very quality based videos that are very informative. I always focus on quality more than I do trying to just put out videos. If you guys have your thoughts on how crit rate works, please put them in the comments down, how you guys think crit rate works. But if you agree with how crit rate works with me as well, or you guys didn't know this is how crit rate works, then post that also in the comments. But y'all have a great day. Peace.